Hi, I'm Janice Switlo, and today I'm going to discuss some details from writings by John Tobias. There is this, and he deals with one myth, and I'm just going to front end this with, that concept that, residential schools were not all that bad, it was just a failed social experiment. And today we're seeing so much attention being drawn to the fact of how Canadian justice system works, or more precisely does not work, and why we have such high percentages of Indigenous nationals in jail. Well, that's no accident. It's actually part of a strategic and continuing strategy to control and undermine Indigenous nations. And the beginnings of that go back before residential schools, but residential schools are a continuation of it. And what I like about this work by John Tobias is that he speaks about the origins, if you will, of when the policy to use the courts and sentencing was put in place. And as I said, this continues today. Otherwise, you would not have, for example, a situation where I was acting to protect an Indian band. You would not have a judge say, and actually an Indigenous hunter as well, you would not have a judge say to me, you will personally pay for this. Because why? I was standing up to protect their actual legal rights and explaining who they really are in law, their legal status. Contrary to the myth, contrary to the picture that Canadian policies have tried desperately to paint for quite a while now. You wouldn't have a judge who theoretically is supposed to only care about findings of fact and weighing of evidence. You would not have that judge who in that particular instance insisted on me putting forward my expected defense of my client prior to the Crown prosecutor even commencing their case, so as to give some chance or opportunity to the prosecutor to prepare their case in anticipation of a defense that they did not know how it would be coming, because I had emphatically said, I am not defending on the basis of Section 35 domestic doctrine. So continuing now, this is from Canada's Subjugation of the Plains Cree, 1879 to 1885, John L. Tobias, originally published at the University of Toronto Press, and it's from Canadian Historical Review, December 1983. So the writings here reflect earlier times, and I submit that the situation post-1982 has gotten even worse. And those in the fields that say, well, gee, we don't know how this got there, what to do about this. Well, you start by stopping using it as a weapon of termination of nationhood status. So he's saying, he opens with, one of the most persistent myths that Canadian historians perpetuate is that of the honorable and just policy Canada followed in dealing with the Plains Indians. First enunciated in the Canadian expansionist literature of the 1870s as a means to emphasize the distinctive Canadian approach to and the unique character of the Canadian West, it has been given credence by G.F.G. Stanley in his classic The Birth of Western Canada, and by all those who use Stanley's work as the standard interpretation of Canada's relationship with the Plains Indians in the period 1870 to 85. Thus, students are taught that the Canadian government was paternalistic and far-sighted in offering the Indians a means to become civilized and assimilated into white society by the reserve system, and honest and fair-minded in honoring legal commitments made in the treaties. The Plains Indians, and particularly the Plains Cree, Nehio, are said to be a primitive people adhering to an inflexible system of tradition and custom, seeking to protect themselves against the advance of civilization and taking up arms in rejection of the reserve system and an agricultural way of life. This traditional interpretation distorts the roles of both the Cree and the Canadian government. For the Cree were both flexible and active in promoting their own interests and willing to accommodate themselves to a new way of life, while the Canadian government was neither as far-sighted nor as just as tradition maintains. Canada's principal concern in its relationship with the Plains Cree was to establish control over them. and Canadian authorities were willing to and did wage war upon the Cree in order to achieve this control. Keeping in mind this waging of war that he describes their actions as is totally contrary to treaty and goes to again this status of Canada being an outlaw nation. And this idea of trying to bring the Nehio, the Cree, the Plains, Indigenous nationals under control persists today. You know, there were many meetings of Treaty 1 to 11 nations who have issued those treaties and gatherings. And I watched as efforts were underway to try to gain control of that through AFN and through federal governments. And now you have federal governments setting up secret negotiation tables on the basis of treaty number area. Not on the basis of nations, which is what the treaties are based on, but rather trying to again control the agenda, the approach, trying to get them to capitulate and abandon who they are, and of course then have the treaties fall. This author says that the Cree made clear they would not allow settlement or use of their lands until Cree rights had been clearly recognized. They also made clear that part of any arrangement for Cree lands had to involve assistance to the Cree in developing a new agricultural way of life. On numerous occasions during the fur trade era, they had adapted to changed environmental and economic circumstances. That's economic sovereignty, the ability to engage in economic matters in fields as they develop and change. Beginning first as hunters, then as provisioners and middlemen in the Hudson's Bay Company trading system, and finally adapting from a woodland to parkland prairie buffalo hunting culture to retain their independence and their desired ties with the fur trade. The new Indian commissioner quickly sought to use now here we get in some of the tactics, because Cree knew who they are, knew they're a nation, knew they could make these demands, knew that these treaties are necessary, basically engaging in diplomacy, as there were certainly no newcomers to that. The new Indian commissioner quickly sought to use rations as a means of getting control over the Cree. In the fall of 1879, he announced that rations were to be provided only to Indians who had taken treaty. To get the Cree into treaty more easily and to reduce the influence of recalcitrant leaders, Dewdney announced that he would adopt an old Hudson's Bay Company practice of recognizing any adult male Cree as a chief of a new band if he could induce 100 or more persons to recognize him as leader. He expected that the starving Cypress Hills Cree would desert their old leaders to get rations. As a means of demonstrating Canada's control over the Cree, Dewdney ordered that only the sick, aged, and orphans should receive rations without providing some service to one of the government agencies in the West. The threat posed to Canadian authority in the Northwest by concentration of the Cree was clearly recognized by Dewdney and other Canadian officials in late 1881. They saw how the Cree had forced officials to placate them and to ignore their orders in 1880 and 1881. This convinced both Dewdney and Ottawa that the Cree request for contiguous reserves in the Cypress Hills could not be granted. Dewdney recognized that to grant the Cree requests would be to create an Indian territory, for most of the Cree who had reserves further north would come to the Cypress Hills and request reserves contiguous to those of the Cypress Hills Cree. This would result in so large of a concentration of Cree that the only way Canada could enforce its laws on them would be via a military campaign. Again, remember, could not actually do that because there are treaties. To prevent this, Dewdney recommended a sizable expansion of the mounted police force and the closure of Fort Walsh and all government facilities in the Cypress Hills. This action would remove all sources of sustenance from the Cree in the Cypress Hills. Dewdney hoped that starvation would drive them from the Fort Walsh area and thus end the concentration of their force. Dewdney decided to take these steps, fully aware of what he was doing was a violation not only of the promises made to the Cypress Hill Indians in 1880 and 1881, but also that of refusing to grant reserves on the sites the Indians had selected. He was violating the promises made to the Cree by the treaty commissioners in 1874 and 1876. Now remember, and written into the treaties. Now remember, reserves, short for reservations. Reservations out of treaties means those areas that are not part of the permissions granted to the Crown, where she can begin to exercise partial political sovereignty. It is up to the Indigenous, the Indian party to the treaties, to decide what they keep out of, the areas they keep out of, where they're granting permissions to the Crown. Makes sense, right? It's their land. They're the ones granting the permissions, and they will dictate and say, no, we're keeping these areas for ourselves. You can have these other areas. But when it comes down to actually fulfilling and complying with that, very clearly this demonstrates that out of fear of them being too close together and therefore maintaining their nationhood and their strength and working together was just not something Canada wanted to deal with. But remember, Canada is not doing these treaties. These are treaties with the Crown. These are terms that are consistent. Crown has a duty of fairness. These are the terms that are consistent in other treaties that the Crown entered into with Indigenous nations. And by the late summer of 1882, Piapot was back in the Cypress Hills complaining about he had been mistreated at Qu'Appelle and making the Cree aware of how they could lose their autonomy if the government could deal with them as individual bands. Well, what do we continue to have ongoing today? This was warned and understood and seen by leaders back in 1800s, that to proceed on the basis of individual bands was to spell out a path which would lead away from maintaining sovereignty, maintaining nationhood, maintaining economic sovereignty, maintaining ownership of the lands. Dewdney and Ottawa were upset. Ottawa gave specific instructions to close Fort Walsh in the spring of 1883. When Irvin closed the fort, the Cree faced starvation. As was quite evident that they could not go to the United States, as they would not receive reserves in the Cypress Hills, the Cree moved north. Piapot moved to Indian Head and selected a reserve site next to the huge reserve set aside for the Assiniboine. Little Pine and Lucky Man moved to Battleford, selected reserve sites next to Poundmaker's Reserve. Big Bear went to Fort Head. So eventually we have issues taking place regarding Métis and what's considered the Louis Riel Rebellion. Though I've pointed out previously that because this took place in an area where the Crown did not have had been issuing governance at that point, authors have pointed out that Métis were not actually engaged in rebellion. But anyhow, the violence that followed the reductions in rations convinced Dewdney that starving the Cree into submission was not the means to control them. He wanted, so first we're going to starve, and now we're going to move on to another strategy. He wanted to use coercion, but this required an expansion of the number of police in the West. Therefore, he recommended that more men be recruited for the mounted police. In addition, Dewdney wanted to ensure that jail sentences were given to arrested Indians so that they could cause no further problems. Throw them in jail under any pretense possible. Having seen the effects of incarceration on Indians, Dewdney was convinced that this was the means to bring the Cree leaders under control. However, what was needed, in his opinion, were trial judges who understood Indian nature at first hand and who would take effective action to keep the Indians under control. Therefore, Dewdney wanted all Indian Department officials in the West to be appointed stipendiary magistrates in order that all Indian troublemakers could be brought to justice quickly. As Dewdney stated in his letter to Prime Minister John A. Macdonald, the only effective course with the great proportion of Indian bands in the area to adopt is one of sheer compulsion. So there you have the police, the judges, The judges, of course, being appointed by governments, the courts forming a part of the government of Canada. Therefore, easy to put this strategy into force. And I submit it continues today. And it continues not on such an obvious way, but because the system works on precedent. If this is what has been done before, we're going to do the same and continue that. No one has taken a step to look at that foundation to say what really went down, but Tobias did. And he did a good job at analyzing and reporting on this. The events at Battleford frightened all parties involved in the confrontation. Big Bear was very much disturbed by them, for he did not want war, as he had made abundantly clear to Dewdney in March 1884, and again to the Indian agent at Battleford, J.A. Ray, in June. However, he did want the treaties, he wanted the treaty territory established, the reserve set apart, etc. Agent Ray was thoroughly frightened and wanted Dewdney in Ottawa to adopt a more coercive policy designed to subjugate the Cree. Superintendent Crozier argued for a less coercive policy, for unless some accommodation were reached with the Cree, Crozier believed that out of the desperation they would resort to violence. So Dewdney did not, however, make use of his new powers. He was granted this. He still intended to prevent concentration of the Cree and rejected the requests Big Bear, Poundmaker, Lucky Man, and others made for a reserve at Buffalo Lake, and later rejected Big Bear's, Little Pine's, and Lucky Man's renewed requests for reserves next to Poundmaker's. However, rather than following a purely coercive policy, Dewdney adopted a policy of rewards and punishments. He provided more rations, farming equipment, oxen, ammunition, and twine, and arranged for selected Cree chiefs to visit Winnipeg and other large centers of Canadian settlement. If the Cree were not satisfied with his new approach, he would use force against them. To implement this new policy, Dewdney increased the number of Indian Department employees working on the Cree reserves, for he wanted to monitor closely the behavior of the Indians and, if necessary, to arrest troublesome leaders. While Dewdney was implementing his new policy, the Cree leaders continued their efforts to concentrate the Cree in exclusively Indian territory. And Dewdney was aware of one of the chiefs, Little Poplar's, growing influence on the young men of Big Bear's and Battleford Assiniboine bands. However, he wished to wait until January 1885 before taking any action, because after that date, the new amendments to the Indian Act would be in effect. These amendments could be used to arrest and imprison Little Pine, Little Poplar, Big Bear, and Pie Pot, and thereby, Dewdney hoped, destroy the movements these chiefs led. In anticipation of confrontations in 1885, Dewdney ordered that the guns and ammunition normally allotted to the Cree so they could hunt for food be withheld. In addition, Indian councils were prohibited, including the one scheduled for Duck Lake in the summer of 1885, to which all the Cree in Treaty 6 had been invited. Arrangements were made to place the mounted police at Battleford under Dewdney's command, and serious consideration was given to placing an artillery unit there also. Not the actions of peace under a treaty. To get improved intelligence, Dewdney hired more men to work as Indian agents with the Cree. These men were given broad discretionary powers and were to keep the commissioner informed on Cree activities. As well, English-speaking mixed bloods, many of whom had worked for the Hudson's Bay Company and had the confidence of the Cree, were hired as farm instructors. There would now be a farm instructor on each Cree reserve with explicit instructions to keep the Indian agent informed of what was happening on his reserve. Staff who had personality conflicts with any of the Cree leaders were either transferred or fired. Only Thomas Quinn, the Indian agent at Fort Pitt, and his farming instructor John Delaney were not removed before March 1885, although both were slated for transfer. So they favored a course of action that the government could expect trouble from Big Bear and Little Poplar bands. However, Ballantyne, who was a former Hudson's Bay Company trader trusted by principal Cree leaders whose job was to ingratiate himself with Big Bear and report on that chief's comings and goings, he emphasized that there was little danger of a Cree-Métis alliance, for the Cree were refusing to meet with the Métis and were rejecting all entreaties from the Métis, suggesting the two should make common cause. On the basis of these and similar reports, Dewdney and the police were convinced that, although a number of councils were expected in 1885, no violence was to be anticipated from the Cree. Nevertheless, Dewdney wished to prevent the Cree from holding their councils, unlawful interference with their exercise of their governance. His strategy was to make the Cree satisfied with the treaties. He therefore admitted in February 1885 that the government had violated the treaties and ordered delivery to the Cree of all goods the treaties had stipulated. In addition, he ordered a dramatic increase in their rations. If this failed to placate them, he planned to arrest their leaders, use the police to keep the Cree on their reserves, and to depose any chief who attempted to attend an Indian council. Dewdney had the full support of Ottawa for his policy of arresting Cree leaders. The only reservations the Prime Minister expressed were that Dewdney have sufficient forces to make the arrests and that he provide enough evidence to justify the charges of incitement to an insurrection. Who's actually inciting insurrection? MacDonald also volunteered to communicate with the stipendiary magistrates, to talk to the judges, to assure their cooperation in imposing long prison terms for any Cree leader convicted of incitement. Such is the status of justice in Canada when it comes to Indigenous nationals. MacDonald was willing to provide his assistance because Dewdney had earlier complained that he could not use preventative detention. That means no crimes committed. Preventative detention of Indian leaders because the magistrates only look at the evidence and the crime committed when giving out sentences, rather than taking into consideration the nature of the man and the harm that he might do if he were released at an inopportune time. The Riel Rebellion of 1885 provided Dewdney with a new instrument to make his coercive policy effective. The troops sent into the Northwest to suppress the rebellion could be used to destroy the Cree movement for an Indian territory. The Cree themselves would provide the excuse Dewdney needed virtually to declare war on the bands and leaders who had led the Cree movement for treaties to be respected. To heighten the irony, it was the Métis movement from which the Cree had held aloof, which would give Dewdney the excuse to use military force to subjugate the Cree. Now remember, an unlawful act does not become lawful by its action. So while this author is saying that the Cree were subjugated, I say there was an attempt. But the Cree, the Nehio, more so than many, one of the leaders in preserving their nationhood and who they are, were not done in at this time in history. Dewdney maintained that the Battleford, Fort Pitt, and Duck Lake Cree were part of the Riel Rebellion. Privately, Dewdney reported to Ottawa that he saw the events at Battleford and Frog Lake as the acts of a desperate, starving people and unrelated to what the Métis were doing. In fact, Dewdney had sought in late March to open negotiations with the Battleford Cree, but Ray refused to meet the Cree leaders. Subsequent efforts to open negotiations ended in failure because there was no way to get a message to Poundmaker. And after Colonel Otter's attack on the Cree camp, the Poundmaker's camp, any thought of negotiations was dropped. Turning briefly to that attack, Otter reached Battleford without seeing an Indian. He was upset that he and his troops would not see action. He therefore proposed that he attack the Indian camp at Poundmaker's Reserve. Now remember, this is a reserve. This is where Her Majesty has not received any permissions whatsoever to exercise any partial political sovereignty, meaning she cannot send her troops in there. He therefore proposed that he attack the Indian camp at Poundmaker's Reserve. Middleton vetoed the plan, but Dewdney welcomed it as a means to bring the Cree under government control. Taking the lieutenant governor's approval to be paramount to Middleton's veto, Otter launched his attack. The engagement, known as the Battle of Cut Knife Hill, almost ended in total disaster for Otter's force. With Big Bear and Poundmaker in custody, Dewdney prepared to use the courts in the manner he had planned before the Riel Rebellion. Both Cree leaders were charged with treason felony despite Dewdney's knowledge that neither man had engaged in an act of rebellion. Eyewitnesses to the events at Fort Pitt, Frog Lake, and Battleford all made clear that neither chief was involved at all. They were charged to elicit prison sentences that would have the effect of coercing the Cree to accept government control. Capitulate, give in, come under Canada. Exactly what we are seeing today. Only the inducements are bags of money. The inducements are these threats that, you will only get more money if you do this. Don't believe it. They were charged to elicit prison sentence that would have the effect of coercing the Cree to accept government control. The trials were conducted to have the desired result, and both Big Bear and Poundmaker were convicted and sentenced to 3 years in Stony Mountain Penitentiary. Neither man served his full term, and both died a short time after their release from prison. Recently, Poundmaker was exonerated of these charges. So, increasing the size of the mounted police force and using the police to arrest the Cree leaders who protested against his policies, he broke up Cree bands, deposed Cree leaders, forbade any Indian to be off his reserve without permission from the Indian agent. By 1890, through vigorous implementation of the Indian Act, Dewdney and his successor, Hayter Reed, had begun the process of making the Cree an administered people. Not the actions of a lawful government, the actions instead of an outlaw nation. This is what Canada persists, this attitude, this effort to control, to administer, to undermine the fact of Indigenous nations, to undermine thus the treaties which bind the Crown and therefore bind her Canadian governments. It's the same tactics, it continues. How many Indigenous nationals have been killed, and the perception is that justice has not been done. The instruments of their demise, those people have been released, they've not been convicted. What takes place in the courtroom is controlled by the judges, and the judges are appointed by government people, and government, Prime Minister, for example, for higher court judges. The incarceration, the heavy fines, the sentencing, the take care of the troublemakers, those people who are at the front lines of quote-unquote protests, where really what they're doing is emphasizing this remains our land, you do not have the right to do these things. We have treaties, we have relationships. You must engage in proper diplomacy. You cannot do this. This persists. This is why Canada has its quote-unquote Indian problem. But in reality, Canada has a government problem. Canada has a racist attitude problem, a systemic problem that persists in believing that it's not okay that these people are the foundation of what Canada becomes, and instead wants to destroy that foundation, bring these people and their nations, destroy them, and bring them under Canada. Well, it's not proving to be a very sound strategy, and it's not going to work, no matter how much money you throw at it, which of course is another issue. Whose money is being spent on this? Do Canadians have a right to know how much is being spent in trying to coerce Indigenous nationals into giving up, when there's no need to, when we already have a foundation of treaties upon which to build? And that's all I have to say.